Welcome guys to the second episode of learning how to read Yu-Gi-Oh cards. In this episode we'll be talking about special summoning. If you haven't checked out my last video where we talked about colon and semicolons, that'll be linked in the description down below. So let's get right into the video. And today we're going to be talking about understanding the difference between the two separate groups in summoning. So there are two groups, group 1 being effects that summon. This includes monsters that special summon using flip, ignition, quick, or trigger effects. This also includes spells and traps that summon a monster, like Monster Reborn. All of these actually start a chain. Now in group 2 we have built-in summons. These are monsters that can special summon themselves that doesn't start a chain. This includes monsters like Cyber Dragon, XYZ summons, Synchro summons, and Contacts fusion. So what we have to understand here in this is that chains have nothing to do with negating a summon. We'll be looking at that specifically towards the end of the video, so if you already understand the difference between these two groups, you can just jump to the last part. I have the timestamps linked at the bottom, so you can go and have a look there. Alright, so here we have basically the index. So conditions, those are the columns, they are still green, the activation semicolons are still red, as well as the effects, which will be in blue. We talked about this in the last episode. And then we are going to add effect summons, which will be written in purple, and also built-in summons, which are written in orange. As always, I'll be using examples from the official Yu-Gi-Oh rulebook. So before we jump in, we have to understand the difference between the two separate monsters. So we've got Sangon, which was taken from the last video. He has a colon and a semicolon, meaning that he can start a chain. And we have Cyber Dragon, who doesn't contain a colon or a semicolon, so he cannot start a chain. Now before any of this gets confusing, I'll explain what the difference means. So effect summon starts a chain, so that means you can chain to it whatever you want. If you have a spell trap, chain it. If you have a monster effect, chain it. If you have a graveyard effect, chain it. You can chain to this. The link is open so you can chain. Now a built-in summon does not start a chain. You can only negate the summon of monsters. This is purely response. This is not chaining. That's the main difference between the two of them. Effect summons, chain whatever you want. Built-in summons, only negation of the summon. Now, the built-in summons gets a little bit more complicated, but we'll be looking at that a little bit closer towards the end of the video. So, let's jump right in. So, group number 1, effect summons. This is what starts chains. So we have here flip summons, ignition summons, trigger effect summons, and spell trap summons. So this is basically group 1. This is all that falls into this category. So if we're looking here plainly at flip summons, a flip summon is seen as a effect summon. So if we look at Falco's description, what he says is flip, opens the link. You can target one Shaddoll monster in your graveyard except for itself, special summon it in face down defense position. So what we have to understand here is flip has a colon, meaning that your opponent can chain to this. The link opens, your opponent can chain whatever they please. So flip summon is an effect, so when the card flips, the effect activates. So if we look at ignition effects, this is where it gets a little bit more technical. So here it says these are effects that you have to manually do in your main phase. This is what's the difference between a general trigger effect. The ignition effect is something that you physically have to do. So here it says you can banish this card from your graveyard, special summon one Destiny hero from your deck. So the banishing from your graveyard is a motion that you physically do. You go through your graveyard, you search him out, you banish him, activate the effect. And important to remember here is, just like every other card, if the link opens for a chain, before you can do the activation of it, you first have to wait for the chain to resolve backwards. So if your opponent doesn't chain, you can go ahead and special summon. If they chain to it, you first have to wait for the chain to resolve backwards before you can activate the effect. So here again, the main difference between this card and the flip card is that the flip card is in action, and this is something that you physically have to go and do. So if we now look at a trigger effect. So a trigger effect activates when the card is special summoned, and of course it starts a chain. So if we look at this card, it says when this card is special summoned, you can special summon any number of hero kids from your deck. So the trigger happens here is when the card hits the field, his effect activates. Now, again, Hero Kid has a colon, so it starts a chain. Hero Kid falls then under the category trigger effects. Now, these categories are kind of specific, and if you're not really one to be able to tell the difference precisely, the only thing you really have to pay attention to what even is the difference between effect summon and a built-in summon. So effect summons always contain a colon and a semicolon, and built-in summons don't. So that's the main thing that we're really focusing on here. We're just categorizing them to be a little bit more specific about it. So if we look at our last group, which is actually the spells, so spell summon effects, this is something that might be a little bit confusing, but if we look at the effect, it says special summon one elemental hero monster from your hand. This turn, that monster cannot attack and returns to the hand during the end phase. Now if we look at this, there is no colon or semicolon, but all spells and traps always start a chain. That's why they fall into category 1. Category 1 is literally just everything that opens the link for chaining. And this again applies to traps. So as always, this one here says special summon one level 2 or lower warrior type monster from your deck. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card. So again, no colon, no semicolon, but that doesn't matter. Just like Fake Hero, this trap card starts a chain because activating a trap card always starts a chain. So traps and spells fall into the first category because they start chaining. Now, these cards are very easy to understand. Like said, if you want to be very technical about it, you can dissect them into the separate groups that they are, but the main thing that you have to focus on is the colon and the semicolon. So this just allows your opponent to chain whatever they feel like chaining to it. Maybe they have a response, or maybe they have a card effect that could help in this moment, or they just see a gap to activate one of their monster's effects. This is basically just opening for your opponent to act. Now we're going to be looking at the built-in summons, which is quite technical and hard to properly understand. So group 2 does not start a chain, but there are a little bit of loopholes in the statement. So what we got here is a built-in summon, a condition summon, as well as a contact summon, and finally a specific summon. So again, these are categorizing them very specifically. Most of the players won't even know which category these cards fall into. Again, that's not really bad. You just have to understand the main subject of a built-in summon. So we'll be looking at that now. So here we have Cyber Dragon, my favorite example, as you will see throughout the course of these episodes. So a built-in summon. This is a basic example of a built-in special summon. It doesn't start a chain because there is no colon or semicolon. So if we read his text, it says here, if your opponent controls a monster and you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. And as you can see, from your hand is highlighted, it's bold, because that's the important part of this card. So what happens here is your opponent can react to this. Your opponent cannot chain whatever he feels like chaining. The only cards he can activate in this time and moment is something to negate the summoning from your hand. That's the part that he can react to. So, important to understand, it doesn't start a chain because there is no colon or semicolon, but that does not mean that the summon can't be negated. We have to look at the parentheses showing from where the monster is summoned. If it has parentheses, then its summon can be negated, otherwise not. So that's also something that you really have to be focused on, is where is my opening? Where can I react to this? Because if the card doesn't have parentheses, so the little brackets, you can't even react to this. So if we look at another example, as in Ghost Ship. So this is a conditioned summon. So what this means is it cannot be normal summoned, and if we look at the effect, it says cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned from your hand, again in brackets, by banishing one light monster from your graveyard. So the method is written on the card and the first way to summon it. After that, it goes to the graveyard. So what this means is you can special summon it again with Monster Reborn. The reason why I'm saying this is because a lot of people are like, yeah, but that makes sense. I can, summon my monster from the graveyard with Monster Reborn. That's literally the effect of Monster Reborn. Yeah, kinda. Some of the cards will say on it, hey, I can only be summoned with my effect. You cannot even use Monster Reborn with me. And the thing is, a lot of times is Yu-Gi-Oh! Gets so brutally complex when you're playing back and forth and you're in a game for 20 minutes and you already got a chain link that's up to 5 chains, and at one point you kind of just lose sight of everything. So this is basically just to show you, when playing, please take your time to read the cards, because first of all, here when we look at this card, it cannot be normal summon or set. That's just how it is. It has to be special summoned from your hand by banishing one light monster from your graveyard. So that's its condition. But the interesting part about this is, first of all, your opponent can't chain whatever they want. They can only negate the summon from your hand. So that's the most important part here. And also knowing that when this card goes to the graveyard, I can bring him back with Monster Reborn. So if we look here at Elemental Hero Neos Marine, it's a contact summon. So what this exactly means is, if we look at his effect, you need 2 different Neoses basically to summon him out, and it says here, must first be special summoned from your extra deck. This is in parentheses, and it says then by returning the above cards you control to the deck. And it even says here, you do not use polymerization. Even though it's a fusion card, it says here you cannot poly this card. Now, if we continue reading, we can see here there's a colon that says, once per turn, you can destroy 1 random card in your opponent's hand. Now, if we think back to what I just said before, I said you cannot chain to these cards. Now, that's not entirely true. As we know, we can react to the summon to negate the summon. But the card still has an effect, and the effect here is, once per turn, you can destroy 1 random card in your opponent's hand. That opens the link to the effect, not to anything before that. The summoning cannot be affected by the chain. The summoning can only be affected by the reaction. So here, if my opponent wants to chain to this, they can. So this is important to remember. Contact fusion is different from a normal fusion. Normal fusion uses spells and traps to fuse, allowing a chain to happen. So that's the whole difference between the 2 of them. And also we're going to be looking at exactly how to play around this whole chaining and reaction. So the next few cards are going to be a bit more intense. I suggest you to pause the video, read everything through, go back again, and just really take your time with this, because this is actually something very, very important that will save you from misplaying in the future. So next up, we have a specific summon. So this is a very specific requirement in how to summon this card, and here it says cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from hand, brackets open so my opponent knows what to target, by attributing 3 monsters including at least 1 Destiny hero monster, and cannot be special summoned by other ways. So this card tells you, hey, listen here, you cannot get me out of the graveyard with Monster Reborn. It doesn't work. I can only be summoned by my own effect. Now, here's also something that I need to note. These cards here tell you what you can negate, and the only thing you can negate here is the special summon from hand. You cannot remove any of the monsters that I'm tributing. If you cannot react to that. You can only react to the summoning from hand. What's in the brackets is the place for you to react to. Now if we look further down, it says here, if you still control this face-up card during your opponent's next standby phase, after you special summoned it, open the link, half your opponent's life points. So the summoning went through, it happened, your opponent couldn't negate it, but your opponent does have a response to the card's effect. Now that will go through. So it's important to understand, even if you do this, it cannot be special summoned by other ways, like Monster Reborn. Your opponent can only react to the summoning from hand. He cannot do anything to the stuff that you are tributing, and your opponent can react to the card's effect. So here we have a card that is so really brutally complex, and that's why really gonna take my time to explain this. This is not an easy card to understand. It's a little bit back and forth, and this is where a lot of players get confused because, you know, when you play with the cards, you're so in thought that it doesn't even occur to you that some things you can't even do. Usually when you play online, the computer tells you, oh, you can activate this and you can't activate that and you can't do this, and sometimes you activate a card, but the effect still goes through and then you don't understand why. You know, you read the card, you read your action, and for some reason it just didn't affect it, and that's because cards are explained very complicated. So here we'll be breaking it down. So here we have a built-in summon. So it says here, cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned with Rise of the Stake deity, and cannot be special summoned by other ways except its own effect. So here again we know Monster Reborn doesn't work. I can only summon it with its own effect. Now afterwards it says here, this card gains 500 attack for each reptile type monster in your graveyard. This card cannot be targeted and is unaffected by spell, trap effects, and other effect monsters' effects. So this literally tells me that when I summon this card, the summon will go through. You know, if we look here, we can even see there is no brackets. So my opponent couldn't even react to this, and then the card afterward tells you I'm unaffected by spell traps and other effects. So those are also two things to look at. If the card has no brackets, your opponent can't even react to it, and then other cards will tell you on top of it, hey look, I can't even be targeted. But if we look further down, there are still two separate effects to this card. So the first effect goes, when this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can banish one other reptile type monster from your graveyard, special summon this card. So if we go up to the sentence above, it says cannot be special summoned by other ways except by its own effect. So we have two different types of effects to get him back onto the field. One through the graveyard and one through a special summon on top. So this actually opens the link for your opponent to chain. Your opponent can chain to this. And then there is a second effect that says when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, open link, place one hypervenom counter on it. When 3 hyperventer counters are on this card, you win the duel. So again, your opponent can chain to this, and they most probably will chain to this because this is just horrible if you get to win the duel with 3 counters on it. But this is a card that is very, very complex. So if we break this down, these are the most important parts. So first of all, you cannot normal summon this card. The first way to summon it is with Rise of Snake's deity card. After that, it can't be summoned by other ways, except by its own effect, the one on top, the one at the bottom. Its own effect is explained later in the text, at the bottom, like said. It has a trigger effect that it can use to summon itself from the graveyard, and then this is allowed because the text specifically says it can only be summoned by its own effect. Since the text also says you can't use any other methods to summon it, you can't use Monster Reborn and etc. like mentioned before. And also note that even though the built-in summon does not start a chain, the trigger effect does. So this card is a bit more complex because we have a bunch of different rules going on. And also one thing that I really want to point out is there are no brackets. So even if the card didn't say this card cannot be targeted, it literally cannot be targeted because there are no brackets. The brackets is what allows the card to be targeted to negate its summon. So we're going to look at another example, which is also like this. It's not too complex as the last one, but the Dragon Queen of Tragic Endings already sounds fun to play against. Cannot be normal summoned or set. Must be first special summoned from your hand, allowing your opponent to react to this, while you control 3 or more face-up continuous spell cards. Again, understand, you cannot react to remove one of his face-up continuous spell cards. You just cannot do that. The card only allows you to effect the summon from hand. Then afterwards comes the effect, and it says when this attacking card inflicts battle damage to your opponent sends 1 card from their hand to the graveyard, then you draw 1 card. So here the link opens so you can chain to this, and then we move on to the second effect that says during your standby phase, if this card is in your graveyard and was sent there from the field, you can send 1 face-up continuous spell card you control to the graveyard. Special summon this card from the graveyard. Alright, now if we look at this, there's one more thing here that the card does not tell you. It doesn't tell you the only way you can get me back out is by my own effect. It gives you 2 different effects to get him out, but you can still use Monster Reborn on him. Alright, if we look at this now a little bit more in depth, in case the first way you summon this card is from your hand by controlling 3 continuous spell cards, after that, you can use Monster Reborn on it since it doesn't say that you can't. And remember, Monster Reborn you can use on those monsters that was successfully summoned. So if you were trying to summon out your monster and your opponent negated it and the monster went to the graveyard, you cannot get it out with Monster Reborn. You have to have a successful summon. Also, it has a trigger effect that can also be summoned through it, so there's another way to get out this card, and it has a built-in summon so it doesn't start a chain, but the trigger effect does. So I hope this kind of explained the difference between these 2 sections of cards. It's quite a bit of a process, but if we want to look specifically at the Nagation of Summon, you know, some cards like Thunder King Ryo or Steel's Worm Roach can negate the summon of monsters. But there's one very important thing you need to know. These effects can only negate the actual summon. They can't negate the effect that summons, or a spell trap that summons. So literally what I mean with that is, if the card tells me I need to banish a light monster that I control, my opponent can't remove the light monster. They can only negate the actual summon. So that's also very important to understand. Yeah, so in other words, they can only negate the built-in summon, meaning the summon from group 2. Group 2 is always a built-in, it's not the effect summon. This is also really easy to remember. Just look at the parentheses. It will tell you from where the monster is being summoned. If it has parentheses, then its summon can be negated, otherwise it can't. Like mentioned before when we looked at the other cards, if there's no parentheses, you can't even negate the summon. As long as there's parentheses telling you, okay, it's being summoned from the hand, it's being summoned from the extra deck, it's being summoned from the deck, from the graveyard, from wherever, as long as it tells you where it's being summoned from, you can negate. So again, let's use Cyber Dragon as an example. Just pretend it's written like this. If your opponent controls a monster and you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. So damn it, my opponent just rioed me. But hey, they can, because it says from hand. It tells me from where it's going from, so now I know, alright, I can negate this. And remember that even though you can't negate the summon from Monster Reborn, Call of the Haunted, or Mystic Tomato, you can still negate those cards' effects themselves, like with Magic Jammer, Seven Tools of the Bandit, or even Divine Wrath. You just can't use cards whose sole purpose is to negate the summon. That's a little bit more complex. I'll be doing actually a separate video on talking about this alone, because this is quite an it's an extreme topic on its own. Right now I just want to show you the difference between chaining and reacting. So the actual things to remember and to take away from this video is read your cards carefully and follow what they say. Anything that says where it's summoned from in parentheses can be negated by cards that negate the summon, like Thunder King, Raya, or Horns of Heaven. Now, XYZ, Synchros, Contact Fusion summons can also be negated, but it does not open the link for a chain. Now, the main difference between the effect summons and the built-in summons is that the effect summons allow you to chain whatever cards you want, and the built-in summons only allow you to respond to negate the summon, unless there is a separate card effect. But a card effect has nothing to do with the summoning. It's two separate sections. So again, just look at the parentheses showing from where the card is coming, and if it has parentheses, then the summon can be negated, otherwise it can't. And just make sure to read if the monster can be brought back with Monster Reborn. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I know it's a little bit a hectic one. Like I said, just go back, pause, read through it. It's quite an in-depth topic that I just wanted to put together a bit more constructively. Again, I'll be talking about the whole negating the summon and responding to it properly in a separate video, because that is quite a tough one on its own. This here was just to understand which cards I can actually do a proper chain to, and which cards I can only negate the summon if I even can. And those cards that I can't chain to, knowing that when I can bring them back with Monster Reborn and when not, and also knowing that the effects have nothing to do with the summoning themselves. Anyways guys, hope you enjoyed this video. I have my blog at the bottom, there's a link to it, and there I will be talking more about this in depth and showing chain reactions to it and other little tips and tricks. They are more meta related. This here is more just a easy overview in understanding just the general card effects. If you like the video, you can also comment down below and give me your thoughts to this. And yeah, I'll be catching you next week for the next episode. Alright, love you guys lots, and I'll catch you later.